116 square kilometers. Write that number down. Not because it is large. In the context of a war being fought across a front line stretching more than 1,000 kilometers, 116 square kilometers sounds almost insignificant. It is not insignificant. It is the number that broke Putin's entire strategic plan for 2026. The number that exposed 4 simultaneous structural failures inside the Russian military machine. The number that military analysts at the Institute for the Study of War released publicly on May 2nd, 2026, and that Russian state media has not reported, will not report, and cannot explain away. Because 116 square kilometers is not just territory. It is the net result of Russia's most ambitious coordinated offensive since 2024. Nearly 200 military maneuvers per day along every critical sector of the contact line. Russia's most experienced combined armies fully mobilized. The full weight of Moscow's remaining offensive capacity directed at a single objective. And at the end of April, after all of that, Ukraine did not lose ground. Ukraine gained 116 square kilometers. Stay with American Echo Harris. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because that single number is the thread that unravels everything the Kremlin has been telling its domestic audience about how this war is going. And when you pull that thread, what comes apart is not just a failed offensive. It is the story of a military machine in structural collapse across 4 simultaneous dimensions that are feeding into each other in ways Moscow appears unable to reverse. To understand why 116 square kilometers is a verdict rather than a statistic, you need to understand what Russia was actually trying to accomplish this spring, because the Kremlin did not stumble into April's offensive casually. This was a planned, resourced, deliberately timed strategic operation. Putin designated spring 2026 as a pivotal moment in the conflict for specific reasons rooted in specific calculations. First, the seasonal calculation. Eastern Ukraine's terrain favors mechanized offensive operations in late spring. The ground hardens after winter. Visibility improves. Armored units can maneuver across open steppe terrain in ways that the mud season makes impossible. Every Russian military planner understood that the spring window, roughly March through May, represented the optimal period for the kind of coordinated multi-axis push Moscow had been preparing. Second, the political calculation. Trump's return to the White House had created genuine uncertainty about the continuity of American military support for Ukraine. Russian strategic planners assessed that a major battlefield advance in spring 2026 could accelerate diplomatic pressure on Kyiv to negotiate from a position of weakness. A significant territorial gain before summer would strengthen Moscow's hand at any negotiating table. Third, the force generation calculation. Russia had been recruiting aggressively through the winter of 2025 into 2026. Financial incentives had reached extraordinary levels, one-time signing bonuses between $30,000 and $50,000 per contract soldier in some regions. The Kremlin assessed it had accumulated sufficient manpower reserves to sustain a prolonged multi-axis offensive through the spring window. The operational plan that emerged from these calculations was genuinely ambitious. Not a limited push along a single axis, not a probing operation designed to test defenses, a coordinated, simultaneous offensive across every critical sector of the contact line, from Pokrovsk to Kostiantynivka, from Holyai to Orikhiv. Nearly 200 coordinated military maneuvers along the front every single day. The 5th Combined Army, along with elements of the 29th and 36th Armies. Russia's most experienced units assigned to the most critical objectives. The primary target was unambiguous. Full presence in Donetsk before summer arrived. The urban agglomeration of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, the cities Russia has been targeting since 2022, brought under simultaneous pressure from multiple directions before the summer heat made sustained offensive operations progressively more costly. That was the plan. Then April happened. Subscribe to American Echo right now, because what I am about to walk you through is the analytical framework that explains not just what happened in April, but why it happened and why it cannot be quickly fixed. Ukraine's net gain of 116 square kilometers was not produced by a single dramatic battle or a named operation. It was the cumulative result of 4 simultaneous structural failures inside the Russian military machine. Failures that are not independent problems running in parallel. They are a cascade, each one making the others worse. In February 2026, the Kremlin imposed restrictions on Starlink terminal usage in occupied territories. The intention was security-driven. Ukrainian intelligence had been exploiting Russian Starlink usage to locate and target command positions. The result was catastrophic for Russian operational coordination. Drone video feeds were severed. Small units lost the ability to communicate with adjacent units in real time. Navigation reverted to paper maps in an era of warfare where real-time positioning is the difference between an effective assault and walking into a kill zone. Simultaneously, the Kremlin imposed restrictions on Telegram usage within the Russian military structure. This matters more than it appears to outside observers. Telegram had evolved into the operational backbone of horizontal communication within Russian military units. Officers shared orders through it. Coordinates were transmitted through it. Intelligence assessments moved between units that had no other reliable channel. The restrictions severed that backbone. ISW's assessment was direct. Without stable communication infrastructure, coordinating an offensive operation has become nearly impossible. Ukraine gained hundreds of square kilometers during and immediately after this disruption period. Those effects are not resolved. They are compounding. The winter of 2025 to 2026 was colder and wetter than the previous year. The spring thaw produced what military historians call Rasputitsa, the mud season that transforms eastern Ukraine's terrain into something that defeats mechanized movement as effectively as any defensive fortification. Armored units were literally immobilized. Mechanized assault capability dropped to near zero precisely during the window when Russia had planned its coordinated push across multiple sectors. The offensive timeline that Moscow built around favorable spring conditions collapsed along with the ground conditions. Russia cannot reschedule Rasputitsa. The window it planned around closed before the plan could execute. Journalist Pavlo Kazarin reported that recruitment rates for new contract soldiers dropped 20% compared to the same period 1 year earlier. In the first quarter of 2026, Russia recruited only 70,000 soldiers against a stated target of 90,000. This shortfall occurred despite continuously escalating financial incentives. The bonuses are simultaneously failing to fill the ranks and eating directly into the defense budget at a rate that compounds every quarter. Reported personnel losses are outpacing recruitment. The gap is not stable. It is growing every month. The Kremlin is avoiding a new full mobilization because the political trauma of September 2022's partial mobilization is still acutely present in Russian domestic consciousness. The bonuses are the substitute for mobilization. The bonuses are not working. As armored vehicle stocks depleted through attrition and production shortfalls, the Russian army progressively shifted to an infantry-heavy operational model. Units advancing on motorcycles and ATVs across open terrain against Ukraine's FPV drone barrier are not executing an asymmetric tactic. They are producing personnel losses at a rate that compounds the personnel crisis already described. In the third week of April alone, Russia reportedly suffered 7,180 personnel losses for every 41 square kilometers of territory gained. Every single square kilometer of advance costs the complete effective loss of combat capability of 2 to 3 battalions. That ratio is not improving with experience. It is worsening month by month as the quality of available personnel and equipment declines simultaneously. Let that cascade of failures settle for a moment, because now the 116 square kilometers makes complete sense. It is not luck. It is not a Ukrainian surprise operation. It is the measurable, documented, geolocated output of 4 simultaneous structural failures compounding against each other across every sector of a 1,000-kilometer front line simultaneously. But here is the number inside the number that deserves its own analysis. Russia's daily territorial advance rate was nearly 10 square kilometers per day at the start of 2025. By April 2026, that figure had fallen below 3 square kilometers per day. A slowdown of more than threefold. And critically, This slowdown was not produced by Russia reducing the frequency or intensity of its attacks. Russia increased attack frequency during this period. The slowdown happened despite more attacks, not because of fewer. Russia is expending more resources, launching more operations, and gaining less territory with every month that passes. Alexander Kovalenko from the Information Resistance Group summarized the spring phase with language that deserves to be read twice. The spring phase has effectively failed. The first phase, which began in the second half of March, yielded no meaningful results in any sector of the contact line. They are now taking in a month what they took in a week last summer. A month versus a week. That is not a slowdown. That is a fourfold collapse in operational effectiveness, measured against Russia's own recent baseline. And the Kremlin's response to this data reveals more about its internal assessment than any official statement. Russian state media releases announcements of captured settlements on a near-daily basis. ISW maps these as a separate analytical category: infiltration zones that do not constitute actual territorial control, contested gray areas that remain trapped between Ukrainian positions, regularly recaptured by Ukrainian counterattacks within days of the initial infiltration. Most of the settlements Kremlin media announces as captured are areas where Russian forces cannot maintain a stable foothold for more than a matter of days. The propaganda operation is sophisticated, but it cannot change the ISW territorial map. And the ISW territorial map shows a net Ukrainian gain of 116 square kilometers in April. That number is the verdict the Kremlin cannot rewrite. Make sure you are subscribed to American Echo and have notifications turned on, because Ukraine's operational posture in this conflict is the opposite of the passive defensive image that Kremlin propaganda attempts to project. By 2026, approximately 600 square kilometers of territory had been recaptured from Russian control through a systematic operational model that repeats across every sector. The pattern is consistent and deliberate. Drones identify Russia's weak control points first. Assault groups infiltrate those specific points under drone cover. Robotic systems move in to clear the positions. The areas are secured and held. Russia had captured most of these zones using the exact same infiltration tactic in reverse. Small groups entering gray zones between Ukrainian positions, establishing footholds, assuming reinforcements would eventually consolidate control. Ukraine's response was to not wait for consolidation. It counterattacked at the flanks before Russian units could dig in. Around Kostiantynivka, the southern gateway to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, the hinge point of Ukraine's entire defensive architecture in southern Donetsk, Ukrainian forces repelled Russian infiltrations through targeted counterattacks that prevented any meaningful consolidation. Defense analyst Denis Papovich assessed it with clinical precision. This area has been fortified since 2014. The enemy could gnaw away at it for years, but the cost-benefit ratio is horrific for the attacking side. Around Pokrovsk, gray zones were cleared through local counterattacks. Russian infiltrations were repelled. The pattern repeated sector by sector. But Ukraine is not simply defending. It is actively worsening Russia's situation across every dimension simultaneously. Precision strikes at medium range are systematically destroying the logistics infrastructure that Russian offensive operations depend on: ammunition depots, command centers, fuel storage, the supply lines that move reinforcements from rear areas to the contact line. Interceptor drones are reportedly blocking Russian airstrikes at rates as high as 95% in some sectors. Robotic ground operations are clearing Russian positions using unmanned systems that remove the asymmetric drone advantage from close quarters combat. This combination is forcing Russia to defend positions it planned to use as offensive launch points, a paradox that is disrupting the Kremlin's entire operational planning framework at every level simultaneously. The four structural failures and Ukraine's systematic operational response are playing out against a resource backdrop that makes Russia's position progressively more difficult to sustain. Russia's defense budget reached $186 billion in 2025, over 7% of GDP, approaching levels not seen since the Soviet era. Against that backdrop, inflation above target, interest rates above 20%, a skilled labor shortage across the Russian economy that has reached 4.8 million people. a war economy diverting resources from the civilian sector at rates that are beginning to produce visible structural stress in industries beyond defense. The bonus inflation designed to replace mobilization is consuming defense budget at an accelerating rate while failing to fill recruitment targets. Every quarter that passes without resolving the personnel shortfall is a quarter in which the bonus cost rises and the manpower gap widens simultaneously. And Russia is now facing a strategic dilemma that has no clean solution. As it allocates resources to Donetsk, Crimea's defenses weaken. As it shifts resources to Crimea, the Donetsk front is exposed. Russia appears to no longer have sufficient capacity to defend both simultaneously. Every decision made on one front creates a vulnerability on the other. Zelensky stated publicly that for Russia to fully occupy Donbass would require between 300,000 and 1 million soldiers by his assessment. That is not a projection. That is the cost Russia is currently paying per square kilometer, extrapolated to the objective it has stated it intends to achieve. The math does not work, and Russian military planners can read the same math. Former intelligence chief Malamud assessed Ukraine's current operational posture with precision that cuts through the noise of daily frontline reporting. Ukraine has achieved a robust operational model across all key sectors. These are the most intense and challenging sectors, but they are also the areas where the enemy reportedly suffers the heaviest losses. The asymmetric attrition strategy is producing measurable, documented, geolocated results, systematically depleting Russian reserves, increasing the cost of every attack, forcing the enemy to defend where it planned to strike. Here is where everything stands, and what 116 square kilometers actually means. Putin planned spring 2026 as the moment this war turned permanently in Russia's favor. He mobilized his best units. He deployed maximum financial incentives to fill the ranks. He timed the operation around seasonal conditions that favored Russian mechanized strength. And at the end of April, the Institute for the Study of War published a number: 116 square kilometers, net Ukrainian gain, not despite Russia's maximum effort, during it. 4 structural failures: communications, terrain, personnel, doctrine, compounding against each other across every sector simultaneously. A daily advance rate that has collapsed fourfold against Russia's own recent baseline. Personnel losses of 7,180 for every 41 square kilometers gained. A resource equation running defense spending at Soviet-era percentages of GDP against a backdrop of inflation, labor shortage, and bonus costs that compound every quarter. Kovalenko's assessment names what this means with careful precision. These results are completely inconsistent with large-scale offensive advances. The aggressor's stagnation is becoming obvious and increasingly irreversible. Increasingly irreversible. That is not the language of a temporary setback awaiting correction. It is the language of structural collapse unfolding in slow motion across a front line that Putin staked his legacy on controlling. The spring offensive that was supposed to break Ukraine broke instead against Ukraine's drone barrier, Ukraine's flank counterattacks, Ukraine's robotic clearing operations, and Ukraine's systematic destruction of Russian logistics. And the number that measures the wreckage of Putin's strategic plan for 2026 is not a large number. It does not need to be. 116 square kilometers, written on a map in territory Russia, spent everything to take and could not hold. That is the verdict. Subscribe to American Echo right now so you never miss the analysis of what comes next on Ukraine's front lines. We will have continuous coverage of Russia's compounding structural failures, Ukraine's asymmetric attrition strategy, and whether the stagnation of spring 2026 becomes the operational collapse of summer. Hit the notification bell. Share this with anyone who needs to understand why 116 square kilometers is the number that broke Putin's entire war strategy. And tell me in the comments, do you think Russia has the resources and organizational capacity to sustain a meaningful offensive through the summer of 2026? Or is the structural collapse Kovalenko describes already irreversible? We will see you in the next one.